My name is Rob Pardo, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Game Design at Blizzard Entertainment. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how we approach multiplayer game design. And it's a talk that's going to be very focused, of course, on Blizzard games, but I do have some examples from some other games. Because there's a lot of concepts in multiplayer game design that really does go across genres. So probably the most important thing to us at Blizzard is that we do the multiplayer game first. And in multiplayer games, there's a lot more constraints. If you aren't really thinking about things like game balance or what's going to happen once the game's released, and you just concentrate on the single player, you're going to find yourself in a position that you're going to have to go rip out all kinds of game systems. And I think, like a good example right now is StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2, like the first half of development, and probably even beyond that, all we worried about was the multiplayer game. Getting each of the three races, making really interesting mechanics for all the units, making sure they're balanced, not at a hardcore balance level, but making sure that we're going to be capable of balancing them. Because there's certain types of units or abilities that if you make a super weapon, it gets very tough to balance on the back end. So a lot of what we do early on is entirely multiplayer focused. We do a little bit of work on the single player story, but if you look at let's say Warcraft 3, I think that was a 4-year development, and we did the entire single player campaign within about the last 9 months of the game. The way I kind of look at it is that once you have a great multiplayer game, you can construct a good single-player game from those pieces, but it's really hard to do the reverse. So, the multiplayer gaming kind of divides nicely into categories like player versus player and into cooperative. And, you can obviously do both in a game, which we've done plenty of times, but there are kind of different things to think about between the two. So, for example, player versus player balance really is critical. It's one of the most important things that you can do. You want balance in a cooperative game too, but it's just not quite as critical. Bad game balance on a player versus player game can kill the game faster than anything else. I also think skill differentiation is very important. You need to have the competition aspect so that players can, if they're more skilled, if they're more knowledgeable, if they have more experience in the game, that they can become better at the game and prove themselves versus other players. And that goes very nicely into kind of the ladders and ratings. I think all those things are really important to PvP, less important in a cooperative game. On the cooperative side, though, chat and communication methods are really, really important. It's like now we're going to the world of voice chat. It's something we're starting to integrate more and more to get into our games. We recently integrated into World of Warcraft. Also just having great chat communication, really looking at things like Google Talk or MSN Messenger and, everything out there and how people are communicating with each other and trying to incorporate as much of that as you can into your cooperative game. Because if players can't communicate well, then, they're not really going to be able to play the game effectively together. And this goes beyond just chat. Like another example in World of Warcraft, we try to put in a lot of things for like raid leaders. If they're coordinating, 40 other players or, nowadays 25 other players, we try to put in mechanics so that, it's easier for raid leaders to kind of point out targets or to communicate to the rest of their guild. These things are really, really important in cooperative games. Another example would be things like complementary classes. This is World of Warcraft specific, but it actually even applies to Warcraft 3. When we were making that game, we actually would consciously try to think about how the races would play with each other. We really wanted to make sure that if orcs were playing with humans, there were kind of some interesting synergies and interesting strategies that they could do with each other. But when you get to a game like a massively multiplayer game, then it becomes even more important to have things like complementary classes so that players can really act as a team. They can develop strategies and they can kind of build different class compositions and have a really interesting play experience. So before I get into the combat player versus player combat, or player versus player game design, which is really most of what we do over at Blizzard, I just want to point out that player versus player is not inherently have to be about combat. there are even examples in WoW or certainly in other types of games that economy is a player versus player activity. And some of the game design choices that we made on our auction house were actually because of that. Like an example in the auction house for World of Warcraft, one of the features that people asked for a lot early on was the concept of proxy bidding. People want to be able to set, a price of what they wanted to buy something for, and then have, the game automatically bid up to that point so that they could be hyper efficient on getting the best price possible for an item. And the reason that we didn't put that into the game is because we wanted there to be a little bit more gameplay to the auction house, that people that want to dedicate themselves to being merchants and kind of hanging out more in the cities, because that's a fun gameplay type for some people, we wanted them to kind of have a little more of an advantage if they decided to play that way and they wanted to spend more time at the auction house and more time in the cities versus someone that could just go off and play in a dungeon, but they're always hyper efficient at the auction house. And, the other example I have on here is EVE Online, which, they go to extraordinary lengths to really have an interesting economy and have gameplay around their markets, throughout the game. So another example of non-combat PvP that actually could probably turn into combat is politics. It's interesting, when you see people negotiate and, kind of compete against one another, but it's really currying public opinion and getting people to vote for one another. Another example is racing. And I mean this in two different ways. So there's the obvious example of car racing, which is here. And of course, there's, again, combat versions of this, like Burnout, which is an awesome game. But I also put the Olympics up here because if you think about the Olympics or any sort of track and field competition, there's really not a lot of interaction between the contestants with each other. They're really just competing against times or distance. And it's really just a ladder. And another great example of what I'd consider like a race in WoW is the race to max level. And this isn't even something that we planned or put into the game or even validate on our website, but people have kind of created this player versus player competition all on their own. And then probably my favorite non-combat PvP example is dating. So, and again, this is probably one that can turn into combat PvP, but... And I think it'd be really fun if one of you go out and design a player versus player dating game. I think that'd be kind of interesting to play. Okay, so enough of the non-combat stuff. Skill differentiation. So for a player versus player game, I think this is a really important thing to make sure you have. And it's really easy to slide into the trap of not having it. It's like, if you look at the first one on here, like Twitch skills or micro skills, this is something that very often, your more novice players are going to ask for you to get rid of. People complain about Twitch games all the time. You're seeing more and more first-person shooters come out that have all kinds of auto-aiming in them, And that's fine if that's what you're trying to build. If you want to make a game that really is about the novice player having a good time in a first-person shooter, go right ahead. That's awesome. But if you want to have a more competitive player versus player environment, you need to have things that allow people to differentiate their skills. And Twitch is one of them. And I'm not saying, like every first-person shooter has to have Twitch elements to it, or for that matter, StarCraft is known as, probably a more Twitch-oriented RTS. And that's intentional. You can have a successful competitive game without those things, but it is something that allows for a lot of skill differentiation. So other examples on here, and I just kind of notated the genres that you're most often going to associate them with. But like multitasking is a big RTS example. So something we're very conscious of in StarCraft is how much time you spend at your base versus how much time you spend in battle. And again, this is something that I've seen people try to design away sometimes, where they want to allow players to automate their base. And that's fine as a game design choice, but you are getting rid of another possible skill differentiator for your better players versus your novice players. Economy dominance, strategic thinking, again, very strategy game focused ideas. Knowledge and experience of opposing class and races. This is something that really spans any sort of genre that's PvP. I mean, you can look at that in fighting games. You can see this in games like Team Fortress. The more knowledge you have of how other players play and what their capabilities are, the better you're going to be at the game. Map knowledge is another great example. And the last one is avatar improvement. And this is an example that I don't know is always a great example because we never really intended World of Warcraft to be a heavy e-sport type of PvP game. We obviously intended it to be a PvP game, but we knew that there's going to be some element of the game that would reward you for a kind of time investment. So your gear and your items make your in-game character more powerful, and it's not always skill-based at that point, which, is a criticism that people level at World of Warcraft, but it is still, another skill differentiator. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about game balance, which, is probably the most important thing to get right if you want a competitive player versus player game that's going to last for years to come. And the first thing that I think is important when you think about game balance, and you can do this really early on in your game, is you need to define the criteria that you're going to balance your game by. Because a lot of game design is about trade-offs. You can't necessarily have everything. So you need to pick the things that you're going to kind of hang your hat on. So World of Warcraft, these are some of our balance criteria. We want to make sure that every character class could solo to max level. We wanted them to have an important role in a group. We wanted them to have an important role in a raid. And we wanted them to be competitive in group PvP. And notice that I say group PvP. It was a conscious decision that we're not trying to balance every single class to be able to be effective against every other class in just kind of a duel situation. That was not a goal of ours. And then, probably the most important goal is we want, the actual game balance to be fun. And I'm going to talk a little more about that a little bit later. So StarCraft 2 had totally different balance criteria. So StarCraft 2, we wanted every race to be totally different. An example of how we approach this is that whenever we put a new mechanic or we put a unit into a race, we intentionally don't move that to other races. And it's funny because when I talk to the press, we'll show the Protoss Mothership, which is kind of this really powerful godlike unit on the Protoss side. And the press will say, oh, well, what's the example that the Zerg get or the Terran get? And I go, there is no example because StarCraft's about the totally different races. And that's a choice we decide to make, and it's something that, we're very conscious of when, we're trying to balance that game. So another thing we want to have is we want better players to win games fast. Somewhat of a criticism of some RTS games, again, for more novice players, is they don't like the rushing of RTS games. I'm just trying to learn how to play the game, and suddenly someone's into my base 2 minutes later with, 6 Zerglings, and they wipe me out, and that sucks. And I think it does suck for the novice player, which is why I think things like matchmaking is so important. But it also sucks for the more advanced player that's really knows the game, that they have to spend, let's say, 20 minutes in a game to win versus a much more inferior opponent. So in StarCraft, we really want to make sure that there is that skill differentiation even on game times. So we also want to have offense over defense. We want to make sure that if people are just building, playing a version of SimCity in StarCraft 2, they're going to lose. We want there to be creative strategies in the game, so we're always trying to think of, when we design a new unit or a new ability, we always try to think of different ways that unit can be used. Sorry. And every unit should have a counter. Not necessarily a direct counter. It could be a more complicated strategy, but every strategy there needs to be a counter to it. And, of course, be fun. Okay, so on to the more hardcore part of game balance. Math is obviously the foundation of any sort of game balance. You need to know your spreadsheets. But I think that's the more obvious side of game balance. If you know your math, and things like damage per second and damage over time and hit point and armor classes. Most of us have been D&D geeks growing up. We all get that stuff. The stuff I think is less obvious is the philosophy stuff. So I feel like every unit in StarCraft or every race in World or every class in World of Warcraft should feel overpowered. And one of the things, I tell my designers sometimes, is don't use the math to balance the game into mediocrity. You want everything to feel overpowered. If someone has a siege tank push in StarCraft, it should be unbeatable. You know, that's how it should feel. But it is beatable because there's this other strategy that takes it down. But you want every strategy to feel really fun and interesting, and every class to feel like they're unbeatable to every other class. And that's where I think some of the magic of game balance comes in. Also, I think it's really important if you're the person that's balancing the game, or if you're going to have somebody else balance your game, that you really understand the nuances of the game. You need to play the game. You cannot balance a game through watching replays. You know, you need to be able to play the game because you need to understand things that are not in the spreadsheet. You need to understand things like how unit acceleration affects the game, or how, you know, unlimited selection versus limited selection affects the game. You need to know, you know, how your pathfinding algorithms is affecting one unit versus another unit. And these are things that are not going to show up in a spreadsheet. These are things that are only going to show up when you're playing the game against other players. There's this balance is probably the most important concept at the top skill levels. You know, it's for your most expert and veteran players. But you still should be considering game balance to other players. I mean, there's a fair amount of strategies that we've seen, and especially our RTS games, but, you know, also in World of Warcraft, that if a player's, you know, really, really good and really, really fast, that they can execute certain strategies and defeat certain other strategies. But a more novice to intermediate player, that strategy may be unbeatable to them. And it's something you really need to consider. Another great example is, you know, in team games. You know, you may have balance that works really well for a one-on-one situation, but it may fall apart entirely in a team situation. You know, like Warcraft 3, I think, was a really good example of that, because we had a lot of mechanics in the game, like buffs, you know, where shamans could bloodlust a whole bunch of units, which was balanced pretty well in a one-on-one game. But once that buffing mechanic started stacking into a 3-on-3 situation, it became much more overpowered. And it's something we started putting caps on, and there's area effect damage spells we started having to change. And it was very tricky trying to affect only the 3v3 situation and not the 1 versus 1 situation. But it's, again, something you need to consider. And no super weapons. So this is a tricky one, because super weapons are fun. It's really fun, you know, punching what I call the I win button. But it's not so fun for the other person. And the other person, if it's a strategy where they feel like there was nothing they could have done, you know, the person just, you know, teched up or did something just so they could win the game, and the other person didn't feel like they could have scouted it, they didn't feel like they could have stopped it, then people are going to stop playing your game competitively. So I think a good example, which this is a picture of the StarCraft nuke, which you could argue is a super weapon, but the way we approached it, you know, where you actually have to have a small unit called the Ghost, and you have to get the Ghost pretty close to its target, and then they actually have to kind of do a laser targeting on the target, and then there's several seconds that happens after that so the opposing player can react. So this is an example where you can have, you know, a really powerful weapon that feels, you know, very super, but the opposing player can identify when a player is actually teching up, because they can see the other person's base and knowing that they have a nuke silo. If they're paying attention to their base, they can see the Ghost sneak into their base. And then if both those two things fail, then they get an announcement, nuclear launch detected. So now you can scramble very quickly for the next 5 to 6 seconds and try to find the little red dot on the screen and then stop the Ghost before the nuke falls. So these are all kind of like examples of how we approach the super weapon problem. And then, you know, you need to use your beta. And the tricky thing about betas is that you have a very changing game, and you don't have a lot of time to do a lot of balanced things. And by the way, even though this graphic says StarCraft 2 beta, we're not in beta. So don't read that the wrong way. So one of the things about like how, you know, just a little anecdote of how I approach betas, because, you know, for RTS, we might be in beta for 3 months. And we're going to want to try to get as many balance patches as possible in that 3-month time period. So like one strategy, like I've learned over time, is that if you have a unit or a strategy that's underpowered and you want to kind of bring it up to speed with the rest, then you might consider, when you balance it, to overpower it slightly back into the beta. Because if you don't, your beta players may not actually adopt that strategy in time for you to be able to tell if it's balanced. It's much easier to depower things that are overpowered within a beta than it is to get people to start playing things that they consider useless. So a lot of times, if it's on the useless side of things, I'll buff it a little bit higher within the beta just so I can get people playing with it again, and then I can always notch it a little bit back afterwards because it's easier to go that direction. All right, user interface affects balance. This is something that I think, we all think of user interface as this wonderful thing that makes it easier for people to play our games, which is very true. However, it does have an impact on things like balance and on skill differentiation. So it's just something you have to keep in mind when you do it. So a really interesting example is the concept of unlimited selection, which may seem like, of course you should do unlimited selection. It seems really silly in StarCraft I only can select 12 units. Why would those buttheads at Blizzard ever do that? Well, it's funny because it ended up being a pretty long, drawn-out argument internally about whether or not we should switch to unlimited selection. Because, going back to my point about skill differentiation, it's one of the things that does make it a little bit more difficult to play in a competitive way. If you have, let's say, an army of 100 Zerglings, which is kind of the examples of these screenshots, it was much more difficult to use that unit. So by putting in unlimited selection, not only did the game become easier to play, but that unit became much more powerful than it did when you only could select 12 at a time. You had to keep on reselecting and using them. So it's something that ultimately we decided to put in unlimited selection because we just felt like players didn't understand why they only could select 12 units. It just felt like the UI was somewhat broken, but we went into it with our eyes wide open, knowing that there's a whole host of units that are not going to play like the StarCraft 1 equivalents did. Another example would be Hydralisks or any other sort of ranged unit. Once you can select 50 of them, it makes it much easier to concentrate firepower on opposing units, which is something that was much more difficult when you only could select 12. Another good example is multiple building selection. So these two examples are Warcraft 2, which I don't know how many of you remember, but you actually only could select a single building at a time. So you couldn't just control-click your barracks and suddenly get 5 barracks and then start pumping out grunts. You actually had to make 2 little lines of barracks, and then you had to very quickly kind of click from one building to another building and click on the units to come out, which, sucked in a lot of ways, but again, it was a balance change once we changed it. Subgroups was a concept we introduced in Warcraft 3. So it's a little bit tough to tell through this graphic, but what this is trying to show is that previous to Warcraft 3, when you had a group of different types of units, all you would get is the intersection of those units' abilities. So what it would mean is if you had, let's say, 2 spellcasters and 2 melee units, you would only get the basic commands when they were grouped together. With Warcraft 3, we came up with the concept of subgroups, so that if you have different units selected, you could still get the spells from the primary unit, in this case, the hero. So you can see, even though I have a whole bunch of different units selected, the hero could still cast his spells. Again, it was a really great UI feature, but it did affect balance, and it made spellcasters more powerful. So this is an example that we had during the World of Warcraft beta, which in a way which probably not a lot of people got a chance to play with. It was in very briefly. But we put in this feature, click-to-move feature, where you can turn it on in your UI, and World of Warcraft will play a little bit more like Diablo. So you can actually just right-click with your mouse cursor, and your character will automatically run to that point. It's not the preferred way of playing for most people, but we wanted to put it in because there are some people that were used to games that played like that, so we put it in as kind of an additional feature. But when we first put it in, it got put in a little bit wrong. It got put in so that when you right-clicked on even an enemy player or a monster, your avatar would automatically auto-face them, run up to them, and start attacking. And if that player ran away, your character would continue to follow them. And it totally demolished skill differentiation in PvP at that time. Because now I could just automatically click on an opposing player, and my character will automatically pathfind directly to him and attack him, and I don't need to look around. Spells like blink, or if a person was behind a tree, those things didn't matter anymore. I didn't really have to be aware of my environment. I didn't have to directly control my character. So we actually pretty quickly pulled it back out, because it really wasn't intended anyways. But I think it's another great lesson of if you put too much UI into your game, it becomes very difficult for players to be able to differentiate themselves. Another great example is just UI mods. One of the coolest features, I think, in World of Warcraft is the way it allowed our users to make their own user interface mods. However, again, that has a dark side, because players also use mods to their advantage. And one of the things that we're always really trying to evaluate in both player versus player and in the raid content in World of Warcraft is what mods are out there, and should we be balancing the games for the modders, or should we be balancing for the game for the non-modders? And it's a pretty difficult choice, and it's something we always go back and forth on. And sometimes we make the choice where we actually go and break the mods. We'll put something into the game that kind of makes certain mods don't work. And the philosophy we try to take on World of Warcraft is mods are bad when they play the game for you. So any mod that we see that kind of turns more into a bot or turns into a way that your character automatically casts the most efficient spells or things like that, then we'll try to come up with ways to break it from the Blizzard side. And but outside of that, all mods are good. So the other thing about game balance is that it never ends, if you want to have legs at least. But the other thing to keep in mind is that to players, change is almost always bad. You may have the best change in the world. You may have a class that's totally overpowered, and for the good of the game, you're going to make that change. But everybody that plays that class is going to think that you suck. And so you really need to be evaluating every change that you make into the game, because the change itself will be bad even if it's good in the long run. But you do need to maintain your game. I think one of the things that you see with a lot of games out there that might have been fun for the first 3 months, 6 months, what have you, but eventually some strategy develops and the game becomes a little bit unbalanced, but the developer doesn't have the time or the money or the motivation to go and change the game. Well, eventually that game then starts to die off. So if you really want to have a multiplayer game that lasts for years, you need to also be committed to supporting it for years. As a matter of fact, right before I came out here, I was in a meeting on a Warcraft 3 balance patch that we're getting ready to put out. And that game came out, 4 years ago now, and 5 years ago, and we're still maintaining it from a balance perspective. Banning the cheaters is important. This is a lesson I think we learned back in the Diablo days, when we had kind of open servers and we didn't have a client-server architecture, and it was very difficult to detect and ban cheaters. And once the cheaters started developing their hacks and once they overran the game, people stopped playing it. If you don't take an active stance towards the cheaters and develop technology and ways to track and find your cheaters, then they will corrupt and destroy your game. So plan patches, but you also want to leave a little bit of time in there to be reactive. It's like there's a lot of patches. On World of Warcraft, we plan all of our patches and we come up with all the features, and we'll do things like talent reviews on each class, and we'll plan which class is going to get a talent review months in advance and work on them. But at the same time, you have to know that at any given moment, some strategy will develop or some bug will be uncovered. And if you don't have the ability to be reactive, your game can get ruined fairly quick. But most of all, don't panic, because the other thing that happens in player versus player games is a strategy that may seem overpowered. If given enough time, players will oftentimes find the counter strategy to it without you actually having to go in there and change things. It's if you change things too often, and if you change things all the time just because some strategy developed that seems to be dominant, then players will start using you as a crutch. And they're just always going to go, well, I don't need to develop a new strategy. I don't need to work on that because I know that Blizzard's just going to, balance the game so that I don't have to worry about it. But that's really not what you want. If you look at competitive sports, like I think football's a really good example. every year there's some unbeatable defense. It's the 3-4 defense this year, or it's, the zone blitz or cover 2, or, I know I'm using football jargon, but, there's all these different sort of strategies that, you'll get all the pundits out there going, oh, that's just, that's the perfect defense and no one's going to be able to defeat that. But they do, because the NFL every year isn't going in there and outlawing every single defense just to maintain competitive advantage. All the teams have to do it to themselves. So just keep that in mind, that just because something seems overpowered doesn't mean that it is. You need to give it a little bit of time to develop. Okay, so the next major section I want to talk about is player psychology. So psychology is, kind of interesting because it's not always predictable. And, one of the first things, the first thing I put on here is perception of fairness. And you may have the best balanced spreadsheet in the world, you may have the best balance testers in the world, and you may be able to mathematically prove to each other that your game is perfectly balanced, but if the players don't believe it is, then it doesn't matter. So, and it's something, you have to be a little bit of a politician with your game community and know what they perceive as being unfair or fair, and make sure that you're taking that into account when you make changes, because you can't argue via forums with a million people. You just have to accept the fact that they're going to have their own opinions, and their opinions are going to spread, and you're just going to have to know that arguing is not the answer. You're going to have to take into account the psychology. So this seems obvious, but players actually hate losing at games. But one of the things that, and this really goes to the issue of game length, and the reason I have Counter-Strike up here is that Counter-Strike is a great example of, you can lose, let's say 10 games of Counter-Strike an hour, but also you could win 10 games of Counter-Strike an hour, because the round times are so short, losing's much more acceptable. I think fighting games are another great example of this. It's what gets exhausting is when you play a half-hour or an hour-long game, and then you lose, and then you play another one where you lose again. We have, this problem is rampant in World of Warcraft with a lot of our battlegrounds, because different battlegrounds and different realms, the Horde or the Alliance has become dominant, and then the momentum kind of feeds itself. Like on my particular server, I think the Alliance wins Ultrarok Valley 90% of the time, but loses the Arathi Basin 95% of the time. So it really sucks when you have to play in the battleground that you're going to lose in. And one of the ways we try to combat that is make sure that the losing side still gets something out of it. So in World of Warcraft, if you lose a game of Arathi Basin, you still get 1 mark of honor, which is one of the rewards out of the game. And you also get lots of honor that you can use to purchase things with, versus, let's say, game systems where, if you're doing more of a ELO chess system ranking system and the losing player just loses points and gets nothing, then you're going to have the problem of, if players lose too consistently, then they might stop playing your game. So another question you have to ask yourself is, how do they climb the ladder? I could probably do a whole talk just on ladder design, because there's all kinds of different approaches out there. But I think, again, kind of going back to the balance criteria slide, you need to decide for yourself what your goals are with the ladder. I think ladders are best when they're fun, but I think a lot of people design ladders to identify the best player, no matter what cost. And the example I would use is the StarCraft 1 ladder. We use the ELO system, which is the really popular chess federation system of determining the best player. And it does that well, but it's not necessarily particularly fun to play. And I think a really good example about that system is that the higher ranked you are, like especially if you're the number 1 player in the world, you really don't gain anything by playing more games. Because at that point, playing another game, all you're doing is risking your score. Because the players underneath you don't give you that many points, but you lose a lot of points for losing. So once you become number 1, you're really incentivized to not play again until the number 2 player passes you. So you may have accomplished your goal of having a ladder that determines who the number 1 player is, but your top 10 players don't play games. So how is that fun? So we definitely kind of approached Warcraft 3 much differently with our ladder design. And there's all kinds of different ladder designs out there. You don't have to use ELL, ELO, or true skill. I mean, you can look at things like football. You can look at things like how golf does their rankings. You can look at, the ATP tennis tour. I mean, there's 100 different systems out there that are all customized for the particular sport that it's applied to. And you should look at all those things and come up with a ladder that's right for your game. So you also want to have the right amount of complexity in your game, especially in PvP games. Like one of the things I always tell my designers on StarCraft 2 is that I really feel like 15 units is the magic number for that game. I feel it's the right amount of units that allow you to kind of learn over time. It takes, there's definitely the depth to the game, so you have to learn the different units, learn the different strategies. But in a real-time environment that's pretty fast-paced for an RTS game, you can still, once you become an expert, pretty easily identify the different units that are out there and be able to quickly know what the counter strategies are versus, let's say, if you had 50 units per side. I think that would just be too many. Now, the opposing argument is like, let's say, the Magic the Gathering approach, where they have hundreds and, I don't know, maybe even thousands of cards and spells and monsters and mechanics in the game, and it totally works for them because they're turn-based. You have time to evaluate each card, and even if a new card comes up in a game, you can go, hey, give me that card, let me read it, and then kind of think about it and think about how you're going to do that strategy. In a real-time environment, it doesn't work as well. I mean, one of the reasons that I don't think World of Warcraft works as well as a e-sport competitive PvP game is because we got a gazillion spells. We designed, more for it to be a fun, casual PvP, not a hardcore PvP. All right, so this is obvious, but with player psychology, incentives drive behavior. And I think rather than just, talk about a random philosophy, I would use some examples that we've learned a lot from. So Alterac Valley is one of the battlegrounds of World of Warcraft, for those of you that don't know. And, it's kind of our most epic battleground. It's a 40-on-40 battle. So we really kind of want to have this vision of, kind of like this big gladiator sort of battle with NPCs and all kinds of spells, and it would, take an hour to resolve itself. So, this is kind of the map of it, and you can see like the Alliance at the top and the Horde is at the bottom, and, we really wanted them to kind of go into the middle and, work with the NPCs and fight all these different skirmishes, until ultimately one side kind of pushes the other side backwards and ultimately wins the game. Well, that isn't exactly what happened. This is more of what happened. So, this is when we learned that how we design the match isn't necessarily how players are going to play it. Because the best way to get honor, which is the incentive in this particular, in all of our battlegrounds, is to win the match as quick as possible. So you really don't want to sit in the middle of the map just kind of duking out with other players for 30 minutes. What you really want to do is go kill the opposing NPC that ends the match and declares you the victor. So players kind of figured this out, and it's really kind of funny. At the beginning of a match of Alterac Valley, players will, instead of meeting in the middle of the battlefield, they'll just right by each other. I mean, I think if we allowed a wave emote while you're riding, people would probably just do that. Hey, see you later. Good luck storming my castle. I'm going to try to beat you storming your castle. And just wasn't quite what we were hoping for, I guess. So another great example, which I talked about a little bit earlier, also concentrated on Alterac Valley, is that we wanted players even on the losing side to get some honor. We wanted them to be able to, get something for losing. Kind of going back to that previous point of, we knew this was going to be a long battleground experience. It was going to be a 30 to 40 to maybe even 60-minute match. So we didn't want the losing side to go out of that just feeling like they wasted an hour of their time. So we wanted to make sure that even the players that are losing, they would get honor for the experience. But we ended up with a new problem, which is the AFK cave. So players now learned that, wow, this is a great way just to get free honor. I'll just log into Alterac Valley and just leave my character there and go get lunch. And when I come back, I'm going to have honor. So that was another great example of how players will kind of game the system. So a couple other examples that I just think are kind of interesting is in World of Warcraft, you can just right-click on another player and look at all their equipment. And when we had this in beta, we kind of riffed off the way that EverQuest did it, and whenever someone inspected you, you would actually get a message saying that that happened. And even though they can't do anything to your gear, all they're doing is looking at it, but people just felt like they were getting stalked. And they wanted us to remove the inspect feature. They're like, get rid of this stupid feature. I hate people looking at my stuff. So instead of that, we just removed the message. And now everyone loves the feature. So another interesting example is the rest system. So this is a system we put in the beta of World of Warcraft. And really the concept is that the more time you spend away from the game, when you come back, you'll get bonus experience. But that's not how we originally implemented it. We implemented it the other direction, where when you first started playing, you would get full experience, and then once you played for a certain amount of time, then you would start getting half experience. And players really felt like they were being punished for playing the game more. So what we did was we just redid the underlying math and did the opposite, and we turned it into a bonus, where now if you log in, you get 200% experience. And then after a while, you go back down to 100% experience. It's the exact same system, but now people love it. So an interesting example is Warcraft 3 and the map selection system. So something we did in Warcraft 3 was we wanted to solve the problem of players only playing on one map. Because in StarCraft, people would just pick one map, and every match would be on that map. So in War 3, we put in a system where we would do a selection of 5 to 10 maps, and then randomize which one was going to get chosen for a match, which worked really well. But we wanted to give players a little bit power over deciding which map got chosen, so we kind of ripped off TiVo and came up with this thumbs up, thumbs down system. And the way it originally worked was that you could thumbs up or thumbs down any maps you wanted, and then all your thumbs up maps would turn into votes once you got matched to another player. So let's say you thumbs up map A and B, and then the player 2 comes into the match and he thumbs up map B and C. Well, that would end up being 1 vote for map A, 2 votes for map B, and 1 vote for map C. And then we would just decide which map, got picked, and that's the map you'd play on. The problem with that is that players' expectations with the system was, when I thumb something down, I don't want to see that map. The system's broken. It didn't matter how much we tried to explain to players how it worked, they didn't care. They're like, I don't want to play that map. You're letting me thumbs it down. What the F? So we changed the system. We kept the same UI, but we turned it into a veto system. So now we allow you some limited number of vetoes that you can just thumbs down a map, and that map's assured not to get picked. So we kind of, again, went with player perception rather than try to force our design down their throats. So the next section is visual clarity. So this is a great tool to really help with your multiplayer game. And there's really a lot of great examples. I mean, I think, I'm going to use a lot of Team Fortress 2 examples here because I think it's such a clear, example of how to do this. So, does a unit, gun, weapon suggest its function and power? Really use the art and the visualization to help people understand how your game works. Special effects can really work against you. The artists love them. They love those particle effects. They love their physics, and they're going to go crazy. But too many special effects make it impossible for people to be able to tell what's going on. And Warcraft 3, once you get into those 3-on-3 matches and all the spells are going off, you just can't tell what's going on anymore. It's something that we're really trying to correct much more in StarCraft 2. Team differentiation is incredibly important. In the example World of Warcraft, we actually use the races themselves. In StarCraft 2, we use team color. And another thing is, when you can, avoid hidden modifiers. In all of our RTS games, we have hidden modifiers. We have an armor system and a damage system, and depending on which unit's attacking which other unit, there's these kind of invisible percentage modifiers that determine things. And we found that we've had to do that to really be able to balance the game effectively, but you want to do that very selectively. The more you can balance your game without having to do that, the more visually clear it's going to be to players, and the easier it is for them to learn how to play the game. So some other examples, so this is another great Team Fortress 2 example. I mean, you look at these two guys, and you may never have played this game in your life, and you already know who's going to have more hit points and who's going to run faster. I mean, just from the art itself. But Team Fortress 2 does have a lot of advantages. It's contemporary, so we all get to kind of pull on our own shared knowledge of how the military works and how people look. So once you kind of go into more original IP, it gets a little bit trickier, but even there you can do it. So StarCraft, this is an example of the Ultralisk and the Zergling. So just from unit size and how those units look, you have an expectation. You look at those units and you know that Ultralisk is going to be, a pretty tough unit. And you look at that Zergling and you know he's a squishy unit. And make sure that your balance supports that. I mean, I've definitely seen games where the art and the balance is not aligned. And this is something that can work for you really well if you do it. So in an MMO, much tougher because players can customize themselves. They can be big, they can be small, they can have equipment, and there's not really any easy solves. But I think class-based armor is something that's really worked towards our advantage. Once players are, really work themselves up to high level and they put together an armor set, and we really try to make the art of the armor set suggest, again, the class. So you can look at these two guys, and you can't tell, but actually it's physically the exact same model and the exact same face in that Necromancer outfit. But the gear and the equipment, and because players want to piece it together, really help work with the visualization so that people on the battlefield know what class they're facing, even though the character model inside is the exact same. All right, so we're almost done. Got a couple more slides. So I want to talk just briefly about maps. Again, it'd be pretty easy to do an hour-long talk just on maps. I'm not going to talk a lot about random versus pre-made. I just wanted to make the point that you can go either direction. I think both ways are great, but they both have their, kind of pros and cons to them. We definitely go more the pre-made approach because, we really feel like we have more control over the experience then. And player perception, even if you have the best random map generator in the world, player perception is always going to be the map generator screwed me. I had the bad starting spot because your map generator sucks. So with a pre-made map, we know we can control that more. Number of maps, more is not better. More's better for more casual and novice players. They love playing maps. But you really kind of going back to that, how much complexity is in your game. You want a small number of maps that players can really learn and play on. And small number can be variable by game. I mean, for StarCraft 2, we usually end up about 8 maps per template. But it can be less than that or a little more than that. But if you go to 100 maps, then players really aren't ever going to learn the different battlefields very well. So this is just a quick example, though, of how we kind of solve the map veteran problem. So one of the things that would happen in StarCraft is new players didn't want to play new maps because the map was covered in the black mask. So it meant the players that had played the map once already knew where all the resources were. They always kind of already knew a lot of the tricks, and it made players not want to play against other players that already had those advantages. So we kind of implemented this thing that we called Dark Shroud in Warcraft 3. And it's kind of hard to tell here. It's the bottom example, but we actually, when you start the map, we already kind of reveal the terrain and reveal all the resources. And then there's a second kind of translucency layer that's your fog of war. So once you are playing this map, you immediately know, even if you never played the map before, where all the resources are. You can play the map pretty effectively. And then as you explore the map, there's kind of another level of translucency that happens so that you can tell now where you've explored, and then that's your fog of war. And then there's the last level, which is fully bright, which is where all your units are. So it worked really well for us in War 3, and it really helped people want to explore new maps and not be afraid of them as much. Size does matter on maps. Bigger is not better in this particular case. You want the map to be pretty much as small as is reasonable, for the amount of players. If you make a map too big, then people just don't want to play it because it just takes too long to get into the actual combat. People want to be in the combat. They want that to keep going. They don't want to have to go into a combat with a bunch of units, and now I have to wait 5 minutes before I can get my next skirmish in place. Matchmaking. So matchmaking is, I think, one of the most important things to get right if you want to have a successful multiplayer game. And there's also a lot of unintuitive choices you have to make. So this graphic is trying to explain the concept of critical mass. Every time that I've seen a designer like internally that starts wanting to design a matchmaking system, the first thing they want to do is give players the power. Give players the power over what map am I going to get match made on, what type of gameplay is it going to be. I want to be able to pick, what class is going to be in my group. I mean, they just want every option known to man. They want the power user feature. The problem is, this is the exact opposite of what you want to give them, because this is what happens. So now, you've given them all the options, but with all the different permutations, there's no one in their matchmaking bucket anymore. So even though they have all the options, there's no one to play with. So that's like an example of why we took the approach we did in Warcraft 3. Rather than putting the maps themselves into the pool, we randomized the map because it allowed us to have less matchmaking buckets. And this is the way that we call templates things like 2 versus 2, 4 versus 4. And what will happen over time is that if not enough people are in those buckets, then the template dies. And now people just never choose it. The momentum starts working against you. Another thing that's really important with matchmaking is feedback on the system. And these are both World of Warcraft examples that exist today. One is our looking for group feature, which really gives you no feedback that the system's working at all, so people don't use it. And the example down below that is our battleground feature, which actually does give you some feedback. It lets you know approximately how long you'll be waiting for a battleground, so players know the system's working. And like I just said, momentum can work against you. Once the players don't believe in the system, then they stop using it, and now the system doesn't work. I mean, the most critical thing about matchmaking is getting players into those buckets. If people are in the buckets, then people are getting matched, and they're having a good time. And they may ask you for more options, which you can give them a few of, but if you split that critical mass too much, then it falls apart like a house of cards. And then the last thing I just want to mention just briefly was you really want to decide up front if you want to have an esports game. If you want to go the hardcore esports route, there's a lot of work you have to do. And some of the things you want to think about is outside of all the game design choices, a lot of what's fun about esports is making it a spectator activity. So you really want to make sure you have things like replays so that people can share those and people can learn about the game through watching expert players. It's great if you have a spectator mode. And what I'm showing here is poker. And one of the things I think is really interesting about poker as a phenomenon is that competitive poker has been around for, 50, 60 years. I don't know the history of poker. It's been around for a long time. And they've been doing the World Series of Poker for a long time. But it really got popular, about 4 years ago, because they came up with the idea of the whole cam. And what that did was it allowed spectators to now really understand what was going on in a poker hand. And it really showed the drama, and it really helped illustrate, the decision-making process in the game, and it turned into a spectator game. And suddenly there's the poker boom. If you can come up with ways to do that with your game, it's going to be a very successful esport game. Referee controls, you just want to make sure that when people are actually running events at tournaments, that the referees can actually do what they need to do. If it's saving the game, if it's getting the right people in the matches, whatever's appropriate for your game, you got to make sure those controls are in place. Web support is really important. This is a picture from the Warcraft 3 site where we track all kinds of different statistics. We show ladders. You can actually drill down into player profiles and see the last few games that they've played. You can see race preferences. All these things, again, kind of build a community around the game. And map editor and modding ability is really useful. This kind of goes a lot towards like the referee controls. And if you do have a map editor and modding ability, you really got to make sure that there's easy ways for people to transfer the maps back and forth. And that is it. Thank you. So before I take any questions, I've been told to remind everyone to turn in their appraisal forms. So, all right, questions?
With what you were saying about player skill differentiation, what do you say to the argument that a lot of the things that you listed are the wrong things to test. So that a player
are what? I'm sorry.
Are the wrong things to test. So that if a player beats me, it should be because they're smarter than me or they outplayed me, not that they have a more intimate understanding of the interface.
Well, I mean, that's a choice you can make. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true. It can be true for a given game. But, I mean, is that true, let's say, in sports? You know, sports does reward you for physical skill. It's not just about thinking skill. I mean, I think thinking skill is important also. And for your game, you can make the choice that that's what you want to reward, and you want to get rid of things like twitch and rushing, and that's totally fine. Mm-hmm. But you need to replace that with other types of skill differentiation.
Thank you.
Hi, great talk, by the way. In your esports section, we see that World of Warcraft is actually used as an esport, and you actually have your own ladders and competitions, and yet there's one big feature that's been requested you haven't put in, which is a spectator part. So people are trying. So what's the reasoning behind this exactly? Because it would seem obvious.
Why we don't have it?
Yeah. Why did you decide not to put it in?
Well, we didn't design World of Warcraft up front to be an esport game. We designed it to be a fun player versus player game, but not an esport game. It's something we're now kind of retrofitting into it to try to make it more esport friendly. And I hope one day we can get some sort of spectator mode into it, but it's non-trivial.
Right.
So, but that was the reason. We didn't design it up front to be esports.
Okay.
Hi. Asymmetry seems to be one of those things in a multiplayer game that players really want and is probably one of the most challenging design-wise things to do. So when you set out to create, say, in StarCraft or the different races and different classes in WoW, that asymmetry, do you think it's better to go at it? Well, one, what's your approach to that? And two, is it better to like create the unique things and see how they interact with each other, or to try and build them in a very counter way?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to one of my earlier slides, and definitely a lot of the balanced philosophies I was talking about are very much pointed at an asymmetrical game like that. I don't think there's a magic mathematical solution to it, which is why I say you really need to understand your game. You need to have a good math foundation, but you can't let it rule you, you know, so when we balanced StarCraft originally, I mean, certainly the math was there, but ultimately you really got to know the game at that point. You have to know that you can't balance, let's say, a Zergling versus a Zealot 1-to-1. That, you know, like I would have, sometimes there would be people like in our testing department that would send me like these little balance spreadsheets and going, the Zealot's overpowered because he can take this many Zerglings. But you got to take a bigger picture approach, and you know, I wish there was a recipe I could just give you. Just follow these 5 steps, and you'll know the answer.
But did you find that like some of those asymmetrical things grew from watching it become one other thing being overpowered, or was it like you had them all and you just kind of balanced them out?
Well, I mean, we designed the fun races or the fun classes. I mean, we are keeping in the back of our mind that we have to balance this thing in the future. But at first, we're really balancing for fun and for interesting strategies. And then when the races start meeting, then we start really starting to get down to it. And we take it a step at a time. And there's 10,000 balance choices we make from that point to the end. But it's really from playing the game, watching replays, really understanding what's going on.
Thank you.
Hi. It's about balance and psychology. You were saying on Alterac Valley, on your server, I don't remember if it was either Alliance or Always Winning, and you always showed something that I really liked on Warcraft 3 is the detailed statistics of how many times the Death Lord was used and so on and so on. Do you plan, or why don't you have such kind of statistics reports on the web to say, hey, on this server the Horde always wins, or things like that? Because it would help probably, to get facts to the community.
So that's an interesting point. I actually thought about putting an example about that into my slides, because that's an example where information can work against you. If, we actually consciously don't put up race versus race stats on Warcraft 3. We'll put up things like what heroes most used, or races are used, or things like that, but we don't actually show who wins matches between orcs versus undead. And we do that consciously because we know how players think. Like, you can have the orcs could win 50.1% of the time versus undead, who's 49.9% of the time. And it might not have anything to do with the racial balance. It just might be there's a couple really expert players that love the orcs that skew the average a little bit. But you put that on the web, everyone's just jumping onto orcs, and suddenly your game's unbalanced. So you have to keep that in mind. I mean, that's kind of the same thing in WoW. I mean, if we put up there that Alterac Valley, the Alliance always wins, then the Horde might stop playing.
Well, yeah, okay, thank you. I'd like to discuss that further.
Sure.
Thanks.
Hi. You mentioned how balance is kind of a never-ending process, and also how the
I'm sorry, can you speak up?
Sorry, you mentioned how balance is never-ending, and how it can also be kind of the balancing process can be political as well. And I was wondering, do you think there's really a sweet spot you can hit where your game is balanced, or is it kind of a constant process, or like take WoW, for example, where you just have to keep buffing one class and nerfing another to keep the players happy?
No, there's a point where you can get a game that's pretty well balanced. Like StarCraft, we haven't made a balance change in a long time now. But when I say it never ends, it's that you have to keep an eye on it. Things can change. Like I'm trying to remember the specific example, but StarCraft, we did a bug fix patch. Like, I don't know, I think it was a couple years ago, and it introduced a balance bug. And if we weren't monitoring the game still, if we weren't aware of it and we weren't willing to change it, then at that point, the game kind of could have died. But you can definitely get to a point where the balance is pretty stable, and you just need to keep an eye on it, but you're not necessarily actively making changes anymore.
All right. Thanks.
What is your opinion on cross-server interaction? Is it just a technical flaw, or is it a technology flaw, or is there?
I'm not sure. Like, what's a more specific question?
Okay,
about
here's
cross-server interaction.
Let's say in WoW somebody wants to pug a heroic, but they can't. Well, it's an instance, and since it's a separate instance, you could put it on a separate server and have cross servers. In other words, every different server will be able to plug into it.
So when we first developed WoW, we took a pretty hardcore stance that we wanted the realms to kind of be communities to themselves. So we really didn't want a lot of cross-server interaction. It's something we've been slowly softening our stance on over time. You can already see that with Battlegrounds, right? To make it easier for people to get into matches and to make the matchmaking system work, because the other thing about matchmaking systems is there does have to be enough players in the buckets before games start matching. So we went to that model to actually allow cross-server Battlegrounds. It's something I think in the future we'll probably consider trying to do cross-server chat. It's something that we felt was important not to do, but it's something I think over time we've been softening on.
Right, because I think Battlegrounds you pick up real quick, but if you're talking about instances, there's no way. Because you can only be in 3 buckets at one time instead of being in all.
Yep.
Okay.
You were saying about not letting super weapons to the game. Mm-hmm. And does this mean that this phrase was said in the situation when you produce games that are not item-based? And I'll try to formulate. Whether this statement is true only for classical subscription games, or it is true for all kind of games, and even the item-based games cannot let the situation where the super weapon is available in a game.
Well, I think that what I'm trying to make the example of is in a competitive player versus player game. You want to avoid weapons, abilities, spells, tactics that allow one player to get that give them such an overwhelming advantage to the opposing side that the opposing side didn't feel like they realistically could have stopped. I mean, that's my definition of a super weapon in this particular case. I mean, you can have really powerful abilities. You can have really powerful spells or what have you. It's just keep in mind, if the opposing player didn't feel like they realistically could have stopped it, then it stops being fun. Like, I'll use a really old game example. So I love the game Descent way back in the day. I don't know if you ever played it. Descent was awesome. And Descent 1 had really good weapons. And you really could have that skill differentiation. In Descent 2, they started introducing overpowered weapons that made it so if I picked up a power-up, like a novice player could pick up a power-up and get a really powerful, like, nuclear sort of weapon, and then just one shot kill me and I couldn't escape, even if I was like way better than that other player. He just picked up a power-up, and now he can beat me. That sucks. I mean, that to me is like a good example of what to avoid from a super weapon concept. Does that make sense?
Okay. That makes.
All right.
First, just thanks for being so open with how you make consistently great games. But secondly, you stated that you developed the PvP side first. Was that true for WoW as well, especially considering...
That was not true for WoW.
Okay.
For WoW, we developed the PvE side first. I mean, it was primarily a PvE game, and we knew we wanted a lot of PvP. But WoW was more on the PvE side, especially initially, which kind of goes back to my point. We never really designed it to be esports heavy. We want it to be fun PvP, not necessarily hardcore competitive PvP. And it's something now we're struggling with, trying to get those elements into WoW, because we didn't make a lot of choices early on that allowed for that to be easy.
Did you develop from the perspective of co-op first? Okay, so it still was multiplayer from that perspective.
Obviously.
But, okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's very co-op heavy, very PvE heavy, and we wanted the PvP to be fun, not necessarily hyper competitive.
Okay, thanks. All right. So my question is pretty specific about Alterac Valley now. And the more recent changes, like I said, people keep adjusting new strategies and new counters. And what's becoming more apparent is the choke points that exist in the maps. And they're becoming seemingly unbalanced in where they exist. And mainly the example would be the Alliance versus Horde. The Horde has a choke point in the center of the map, and the Alliance choke point's right in their base. So that if Alliance holds their choke point, the Horde still gets honor, because that's the point. You get honor for fighting and for participating. But if the Horde's able to hold the choke point in the middle of the map, Alliance gets nothing. And that's becoming more apparent. Like, even on my server, Alliance can win, but this becomes the stalemate where the two choke points are held.
All right, so what's the question?
I'm just wondering, have you thought about how you're going to be addressing something like that in the future? Because I see it as a drastic map imbalance.
Well, I think we're going a little bit off topic, because now we're talking very specifically about Alterac Valley. Alterac Valley is... it's like the ultimate post-mortem of PvP battleground design. I mean, I don't even know how much I want to get into the nuances. I mean, we talk about Alterac Valley probably every month, and we come up with some changes, and I think it's slowly gotten better, but it's got a lot of challenges, is all I would say about it.
Speaking of WoW, as how you originally developed it as a non-esports game, and how the player versus player aspect has really become developed. One of the things that you specifically talked about was the spectating and having the whole cam and poker. One of the things that you see in WoW a lot is a lot of people making their own videos, doing video capture, but they're all doing it with external software running to capture WoW. Are there any plans in the future to integrate any kind of video capture? Because you also see people making whole movies of the games as well.
It's on the wish list. I mean, I don't know if it's realistic, for us to get it any time in the near future. It's something that I would love to do, but we didn't really design the technology up front to allow for it. So it's just something that hopefully we can get to one of these days.
Right. Okay, well, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I was just wondering about your take on microtransaction in WoW. I don't know, is it something that you guys won't implement because from the game balance view, or is just because players' perception?
Well, microtransactions is a pretty big topic.
Right.
And, there's lots of ways to implement microtransactions. We just went with a subscription-based model, and I think...
But what I mean, like, microtransaction would be something that players can gain experience faster, because now it's up to level 70. So if
a lot of Asian games take that approach.
Right.
We've decided not to do that approach because we wanted a subscription-based model. We feel like one of the stances we've tried to take in WoW, which is one of the reasons why we actively try to get rid of people that buy gold in the game, is we've kind of taken the approach of we want players to feel like it's a level playing field once they're within WoW. People cannot bring outside resources to give them advantages within the game. And other games don't take that stance, but it's something we've taken very seriously in WoW. And that goes even so far as something like people will buy gold, obviously, from IG or whoever else. And when we find them, we take them out of the game. We take a pretty hard line stance against it. And I think what you're getting at with microtransactions is kind of the same sort of thing. I mean, we could authorize it, but I think our community would feel betrayed at this point. I think that's a decision you have to make before your game ships.
Right.
And you need to let your community know, hey, this game, you can actually buy advantages within the game. So don't sign up for this game unless you're okay with that. I don't think you can go into a game like WoW 3 years later and tell your community that we're going to change that rule.
Right. I was thinking because with microtransaction, it's more friendly for the new players and the casual gamers to catch up with the level 70s. And I guess the perception is...
They're not the ones necessarily that are going to spend the most money, though.
Right. Okay. So I understand. Okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hey, my question deals more about sort of the overarching design for your RTS series. Specifically, why in the Warcraft ones? You had War II when the races were kind of similar in terms of being mirror reflections and, the little differences. You moved to StarCraft, and you had three separate races with, three separate races that were very, very different. And then for War III, you sort of moved back more towards a more mirror-esque sort of design. And I'm just curious, was that based on, Warcraft feels sort of like this and StarCraft feels sort of like this?
No, not necessarily. War III, we weren't as hardcore about the differentiation size because it just wasn't as high a priority, because for War III, it was about the heroes. I could have done a slide, like I did the balance criteria for WoW and StarCraft II. If I would have done one for War III, the differentiated sides was important, but not as important as the hero concept.
Got you.
Versus StarCraft II, we're not doing heroes, and that game really is about the differentiated races. It's just a choice.
Got you.
It's not something that, like if we ever did a Warcraft 4, it might be different. It'd be what we felt was the right things for that game at that time.
Thanks.
Hi. You mentioned that in Alterac that people weren't quite doing what you thought they would.
Yeah.
So how often do people do unexpected things, and how often is it a negative thing from your standpoint?
People do unexpected things all the time. That's what's interesting about the psychology part of it. You just need to be aware of that. The coolest thing I think about doing game design on multiplayer games is you do get better at predicting how players are going to play with things, but they always surprise you. It's just... I don't know if there's a ratio I could give you, but it definitely happens all the time.
Well, how about this? How often do they do exactly what you think they'll do?
I don't know, when we do our job right, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
I know World of Warcraft was not necessarily designed around PvP, but I was just curious on your thoughts on...
Can you get closer to the mic, please?
Sorry. I know World of Warcraft is not designed around PvP necessarily. I was curious of your thoughts on balancing between how you reward player skill versus teamwork in Battlegrounds. Right now, for example, you got players that you get points for being in the area of other kills, and obviously for winning the Battleground. But you have players that might stay by defending a node and then just get killed, but they get nothing in it for actually trying to actually help the team out overall, versus those that just happen to stand around near the fighting and never get killed.
Yeah, things like that are a difficult problem, because invariably, every way you think of rewarding players for, let's say, non-combat activities or teamwork, there's a way to game the system. That's like the example of the AFK cave, right?
Yes.
The reason we were doing the approach we did was actually to kind of solve partially the problem you're talking about. But then we ended up with this whole new problem of players not even participating in the battleground. So, it's like, which is worse? So there's a lot of choices that end up like that.
I agree. It's a very hard thing to fix, and I don't have an answer either.
Yeah, if I had the magic solution, then I wouldn't have the Ultrarock Valley examples for you. But it is something we always think about. It's just... But you definitely have to think about, when you implement something like that, it's like, okay, well, how are players going to abuse this now? Now let me put my black hat on and go, okay, I am evil gamer. How am I going to exploit this? And if there's a way, then you better think twice before you put it in.
I was also curious if your slides would be available online anywhere.
I don't know. I'll have to ask my PR department.
Okay, thank you.
So my question has to do with endgame balance. So you've got as an example for World of Warcraft, you have the level cap. You get to level 60, no more experience, but you've got all of these endgame instances and raids you can run. And the content, why do you go with a level cap as opposed to a content cap? Allow the character to keep getting experience, but along the same rules of, I've gotten to level 75, and I go and I kill a level 70 creature, I'm not going to get any XP for it anymore. There's no more content, there's no more spells to learn, because the content's capped at 70. But when the content cap raises next, I get credit for having continued to play. Are you worried about people stopping to play because there's a patch coming out in 2 months where I'll start to get credit again for playing? So I'm going to stop playing and wait for that patch.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but the reason that we go with a level cap approach is because, ultimately we have to know what we're balancing our game for at that level. It's, if you kind of have more of a soft cap where people can just use, let's say, the same algorithms in the game, and the game's going to get pretty unfun pretty quick because players are going to feel compelled to level past, let's say, level 60, or level 70 or whatever the level cap is. But we no longer have fun content for that. So by the time you get to, let's say, level 77 or 78, there's no level 78 quests. All your quests have grayed out, and you're now killing monsters that give this much experience, and you have the whole South Park moment going on, right? Or I'm going to kill 2 million boars just so I can eke out this much more advantage in a battleground. I think it's better just to cap them at the point that your game's designed for.
But from the balance aspect of, you're worried about players stopping to play.
Obviously, World of Warcraft's a content-based game. So players are going to consume content faster than we can develop it, but we are devoting our time and energy to try to develop as fast as we can so that players, even players that are at that bleeding edge, which, by the way, there aren't many, because most players actually still have plenty of content in the game, but even the players that are at the very bleeding edge, hopefully they don't have to wait longer than a couple months before we have some new content for them to explore.
Thanks.
How did you go about balancing the classes for solo play versus co-op? So, for example, does it bother you that a warrior levels more slowly than a hunter?
There's not a magic solution to that. It's really just keeping all the things in mind. Solo's the easiest because, we can kind of do what we want. And the biggest thing there was, just not falling in the trap that some of our predecessors fell into, which certain classes have the ability to solo and certain ones don't. We just knew that we wanted to make sure that someone could always have a fun play experience by themselves, because we can't guarantee that you're always going to be in a group or that you want to be in a group. So you should be able to log into the game and immediately accomplish some objective if you so choose. But from a balance perspective, it's not that hard to do that. I think the harder stuff comes into mind of starting to develop complementary classes and abilities so that every class feels like they have a role in a group and feels like they have a role in a raid and can be competitive in PvP, and doing all those things simultaneously, it's not easy, and we screw up all the time, and we're always trying to talk about how to correct different problems, and then you throw in things like talent specs and everything else, and yeah.
Thanks.
Sure. Are we out of time? Okay. So I think we're all out of time on questions. So thank you all again.